The latest film from the Exhibition on Screen series, produced by Seventh Art Productions, is The Danish Collector, from Delacroix to Gaugain. And it's my great pleasure to have the director of this latest film, David Bickerstaff. David, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Hello, Peter. Nice to be here. And thank you very much for inviting me on your program.
Great to talk to you about this. And the main part of this film is, of course, about the collector, Wilhelm Hansen. How did this documentary that you, this film come about that I know you co-wrote with Phil Grabsky, in terms of the process of putting it together?
Well, Phil and I are always looking for interesting projects to make. And with the Exhibition on Screen series, our most popular films have always been films about Impressionism. And we've made several of them. And I had just made a film about Van Gogh's Sunflower series. And we have a very good relationship with the Royal Academy in London. And we contacted them and said, you know, what have you got coming up? And they say, oh, we've got this interesting show called, about Wilhelm Hansen's collection. And it was called Gaugain and the Impressionist, so initially we thought, oh, we'll make a film about Gaugain. Why not? Because in this collection, they had a fantastic series of Gauguins. But then when we actually saw the exhibition, we thought, no one really makes films about collectors per se. And this collection is stunning. It is one of the most amazing collections ever. And there's a great story behind it as well. So we thought, let's switch our focus from Gaugain, who is obviously part of the film, but towards telling the story about this probably fairly little known collector in Denmark called Wilhelm Hansen, and who is supported by his wife, Henny. And they amassed a huge collection, which they then lost half of it through debt and through various things that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then they collected again. And this stunning collection, they always wanted to leave to the Danish state. And that's where it is now. It sits in a place called Ordrupgaard at a fantastic museum in beautiful grounds. And it's actually part of the Hansens' summer residence, which became their main residence. So there's like a mansion house on the property where they have part of their old collection, and then they purpose-built gallery spaces to put their exhibition space. And now this belongs to the Danish state, and it's open to the public. And this is what we thought. Yeah. And so it started very much with the Royal Academy. Now, of course, at this very point, COVID hit. And at this point, all the restrictions happened. We thought, Phil and I thought, what are we going to do? Let's try and get in and film the exhibition at the Royal Academy. And all the restrictions had just come in. So there was quite a lot of negotiation that had to go on. Originally, the Royal Academy were insisting that their academics did all the interviews with masks on. And we were saying, but that, you know, hopefully the pandemic will be over by the time this film comes out. As it turns out, it's not really. But, you know, the last thing you want to see is people with just masks on their faces and not being able to see their faces. So we had to do a lot of long lenses, long distance sort of filming, keeping away from them. Everyone had to put a mask on in between takes or in between questioning and things like that. So there was a lot of very strict COVID filming that went on. And so it was a first for me. But it meant that we got to film the core of the paintings in the exhibitions at the Royal Academy. And then we waited a while to see how things worked with Denmark before we actually tried to get over to Denmark to actually film Ordrupgaard, the museum where the collection actually sits at the moment.
Well, I admire your perseverance, because COVID has hurt so many people in terms of especially filmmaking. It's just incredible how you have to be so careful. And look, what always intrigues me about these films is the research that has gone into it, and secondly, the people that you choose to talk about the particular exhibition and the story about collecting it as well, etc. So that in itself must have been an interesting process for you and Phil, I suppose.
It very much is. It's always a very interesting process. Of course, we start with the curators of the exhibitions. They are our central source of information. So we always endeavor to sit down and really have a good discussion with them. The catalogue's very important. The way they talk about the exhibition in the catalogue, the essays and the people they invite to write the essays for the catalogue. I must admit, I do feel like I do an art thesis every time I do these films. It's quite an intense process. It's an intense research process. And also, particularly, I really like to get a balance in the films I make by getting contemporary artists to respond. And in this case, we have a fantastic Danish artist called Delacroix, who comes in towards the end of the film, but he gives a fantastic reflection what it is to be a painter. And in fact, he says some quite funny things about, he thinks that it's quite a stupid thing to do, but we can't help but do it, us painters. We can't help but go and just paint that wave. We have to go back there every day and paint the same waves. Well, they're not the same waves, but it's very interesting perspective on particularly the Impressionists and also the collection, but from a contemporary point of view. And he happened to have an exhibition at Ordrupgaard when they reopened after all the COVID restrictions. They reopened, and he was the first contemporary show. And so I find that sort of thing very interesting. Absolutely. To try and find those sort of people.
Yeah. What makes this film and so many other films in the Exhibition on Screen series is the way that the paintings are photographed, the very careful staging, if you like, of the camera, pointing at the various paintings, the careful movement between paintings and so on. That in itself is quite an art, which with your art background, you must find very useful in terms of the way you direct this.
Well, we keep reminding ourselves that we are in cinema time and not TV time. So although these films go on to have another life on TV where they're cut down to 50 minutes, basically, we make these films for the cinema. And in the cinema, you really have the opportunity to give your audiences a time to look and absorb and take in what they're looking at, make up their own mind to a certain degree, and find nuances in the paintings perhaps they wouldn't normally do in the gallery, because we sort of concentrate on various parts of the painting, drawing attention to them with our long lenses and our sort of close-ups and the detail. And you get a sense that a painting is actually not flat. It's actually 3D. It has texture. It has, it has a built-in sense of the artist's touch. And I think that's very important for us to get across. And the only way you can do that is to actually linger. You actually keep things fairly slow. And I guess sometimes, we have to speed up the edit a little for TV, because maybe it's too slow for TV. But for cinema, it's perfect, because you have a big screen, you get absorbed in it, and really you start to make your own narratives, which is very important.
And you do it so well. Thank you. The whole story, as you say, that hasn't been covered in too many previous films at all, the art of collecting, and what do you collect, how do you collect it, how do you exhibit something, and I found that story so interesting, not just about Wilhelm, but also about other collectors and about the decisions that they make in terms of what they're able to collect in terms of paintings. That in itself is I found quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, we found a fantastic expert in Scotland, Professor Francis Fowle, who's been doing quite a lot of research into collectors. There's the major collectors like Barnes and Getty, and that most people will have heard of. And they're big philanthropic type collectors, where they would buy lots of stuff, and they would then sort of shift it around, and they would have multiples of one artist. Barnes I think had 167 Renoirs. He was obsessed by Renoir. But then she also talked about that not many people realize that some of the biggest collectors of Impressionism were actually women. And I hadn't really clocked that much to my, you know, I don't know why I hadn't thought like that, because perhaps because I was used to these more macho sort of Gettys and sort of Barnes as sort of taking up the sort of focal point. But actually, some of the women collectors were astounding, you know, Bertha Potter and in America, and the Davies twins, who are Welsh, you know, in the UK. They had a huge collection, which they ended up leaving to the National Gallery of Wales. So there was this sort of sense of, well, I often wonder how do these galleries get these large collections of Impressionist art? And it's usually through the collectors and the philanthropic nature of collectors, and the way that they leave things to some sort of legacy, you know, and they can afford to have a legacy. And there's some collectors who, you know, who basically, they just have a lot of money, but they have this passion for art. Particularly Barnes was quite an interesting person, because he would buy objects as well, and he would curate. He'd put an object and a chair and a painting together, and very odd when you go to see the Barnes collection in Philadelphia, it's actually, they've left it exactly the way Barnes wanted it. And I remember filming there, and we said, can we move that chair? And they said, no, Dr. Barnes wouldn't allow it. I said, Dr. Barnes is not here. but still, anyway, it's an interesting obsession, and it's an interesting sort of dynamic that happens in collecting art. And you know, the Hansens were, of course, saw themselves as being socially minded, even though they were quite wealthy, and they mixed in sort of there was quite a cacophony of collectors in Denmark, and particularly during World War I, because Denmark was neutral, and so they could still operate. They could still operate between France and Denmark. And they saw an opportunity when during World War I, the Parisian art market dried up a bit, because people couldn't purchase. And so paintings, Impressionist paintings, were going cheap, basically. And Hansen saw an opportunity, and within the period of 2 to 3 years had amassed a huge collection, and had formed a consortium of other Danish collectors and Danish bankers to actually afford it. Which was an interesting, you know, he was an opportunist, but he was a businessman. So effectively, he had the two. He had a business acumen, but he was also passionate about art.
Mm-hmm. Interesting combo.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you mentioned about women who were collectors of art. I'm also intrigued. I mean, we know about Manet and Gaugain and so many other Impressionist painters, but there would have also been a number of women painters during the Impressionist sort of time.
And yes, and in fact, my favorite paintings in the exhibition were actually made by women, and the Beth Morissette paintings particularly were just beautiful and just extraordinary. This beautiful painting of a girl with a bonnet, and the paintwork there is absolutely exquisite, and it made me look into her a lot more. And you know, she's quite an interesting person. She was obviously married into the Manet family, so she had a good connection there with the Impressionists and stuff. But then Mary Cassatt is another one of the artists who feature a lot, and she helped a lot of the Impressionists. She came from a very well-connected family in America, and she helped actually get a lot of work and put into American collections, and she was also a great experimenter, and she was a good friend of Degas. So there was these connections, and Pissarro as well, that they were all very good friends, and they all went to just north of Paris, and they would paint together. And the women Impressionists I find very interesting. In fact, you know, we are doing a film on Mary Cassatt as one of our new films in the future, because we think she's very important, and it's fascinating to look at this. And I, you know, I was really struck by Beth Morisot's paintings in the exhibition. I think they're fantastic, and I think people should really look a lot closer at the women Impressionists, because they're absolutely fantastic.
Yes, definitely. I'm always intrigued by this. What was it that sort of ended or killed off to some extent, the Impressionist era?
There's a bit of a debate about whether it's killed off or not. I mean, the Van Gogh watercolor just sold for 27 million. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, he's not Impressionist, he's post-Impressionist, but their works still go for huge sums of money. And so the market is still there. Whether there's obviously art needs to move, it moves on, you know, and it went into the sort of, you know, the era of Picasso and that had moved, it keeps moving on and keeps moving through. It's interesting, if you look at museums, a lot of their collections might finish in the 1950s, and that's, I find, quite odd, why they're not collecting contemporary artists more. And they are addressing that. There is a lot of museums who now form sort of, contemporary art collections. So even like we did quite a lot of work with the Royal Collection on a film about Canaletto that we've made, and their collection finishes, you know, very early, sort of 1940s or something. But the Queen must get presents of art all the time. So I find it quite an interesting thing, you know, where history puts its full stops. And I think maybe it sort of needs to shift on a little bit like that, you know, because there tends to be now museums dedicated to post-50s, and then museums are pre-50s. And, you know, you want to, I think there should be more dialogue between contemporary art and you know, historic art, as you might call it, which the Impressionists, with every year, is slowly drifting more into historic art. But you've got to admit, people still find that, you know, they still will buy an Impressionist poster to put up on their wall, or they'll put, you know, they'll buy the mug, or they'll buy the thing. There's something about Impressionist work that works as a graphic memoir of a particular era that is very universally appealing.
Absolutely true. Interesting to hear that. In your film, there's obviously some great contemporary shots of Denmark, of Ordrupgaard, inside as well as outside of France and of London. And that's always great to see those contemporary shots, and they look beautiful. But there are also quite a few photos of Wilhelm. And I was wondering, because many of them are in black and white, but there are some in color. And at the back of my mind, I was wondering if some of those color photos were actual color photos, or were they colorized?
They were colorized. I'm sorry. I have to put my hand up there. Okay. There was essentially there were a couple of color photographs of various artists and things like that, but the ones you see of Impressionist artists and things, they're usually been colorized. There's a bit of a debate in me whether you muck about with archive photos and things like that. But to tell you the truth, I think I was very interested in taking the photographs and giving them a sense of imagination. And what the color does is it slightly switches your imagination from archive to, maybe this is actually real. Is this exactly your question? Is that really what the colors were like, you know, or is that how I imagine them to be? Is that, you know, and interestingly enough, so I had this debate, but then once you sort of go for it, you go for it, and you sort of try to make it a stylistic sort of decision, you know, an aesthetic decision. So yeah, did you find them disturbing or confusing?
No, not at all. It's just at the back of my mind, I knew that photos of that era would not have been in color. Of
course not, no.
But nevertheless,
and if they would have been hand colorized, and yes, probably a little bit better than what we've done. But sort of essentially, I mean, colorized happened in those days, you know, but it was hand colored. So, you know, you'd have the black and white photograph and someone would then hand color it all in. Well,
we know silent films, the silent era, many films were colorized or were tinted or whatever the case might be. So no, I have no problem with that. It looked great on the screen.
Oh, that's good. That was the intention.
Now, the other two, number of things that I always find really interesting in these films from Exhibition on Screen is the use of music. And yes, Asa Bennett's music, yes, as always, is so superb.
Yes, yes. Asa has been a long-term collaborator of mine, and it's great, you know, because when you find other artists who have, you know, you have a synergy with, who you have a shorthand with, you know, we start the process very much. I might be thinking about the script. I'm thinking, you know, I know more than he does to begin with. And then he's saying, keep feeding me stuff, you know, even little scenes, even little bits of stuff and photographs and ideas. And I might send him a Spotify list or something like that of stuff that I've heard, or you know, or I might send him some images and he'll come back with some sketches and things like that. And this is the way that we develop the soundscape. And then it gets fine tuned, obviously, as we go through. But yes, and we're always trying to mix it up. I mean, the last time I did a film on Lucian Freud, and we went very much sort of London jazz sort of style. And I think it's sort of, you know, we need to make sure that we keep challenging ourselves with the music, but also to keep in mind that it sits as a bed underneath a narrative and a story. And that's the important thing, that it needs to actually augment, as it were.
Yes, exactly. And again, it works so well. And it's also interesting to find the right voice sometimes, the narrator. And here you've got David Rintoul, and again, his voice seems so appropriate.
Yes. Actually, David is a favorite of Phil's as well. So, I mean, we have used David before, and he's so reliable, and his voice is so easy to listen to. And I think it's a great sort of thing of the role of the voiceover artist is to give the audience a sense of assurance that what you're hearing is actually a truth of some sort. So they need to carry that sort of gravitas as it is. But it's interesting to play with the voiceover. In my Van Gogh films, I use a Dutch voiceover artist because to voice the letters, because I wanted that sense of it's spoken in English, but I wanted a sense of a slightly Dutch accent, and the best person to do that is a Dutch actor or a Dutch voiceover artist, and we've used him in all our Van Gogh films, and he's been fantastic. So once you find something that is working with the setup, I think that's important. And David, I used him before on my Degas film, but it's sort of he gives a certain sort of gravitas to the facts. Essentially, the glue is what he's doing. He's bringing together the sort of the narrative as a piece of glue.
Yes, exactly. It's interesting to note about Wilhelm that after he died, Henny, his wife, continued the collection and to exhibit and to continue the estate there, that and so on, which was great to see. And then, as you say, it was then handed to the Danish government. So anyone can visit and see this wonderful house or exhibition space, whatever you like to call it, and the paintings.
It's both, actually. It's a beautiful house, and in fact, they before they started collecting Impressionist works, they were collecting Danish realist works. So the house is full of their collection of Danish realist works, which is they're beautiful paintings. And then the exhibition spaces, and there's some contemporary exhibition spaces. So you get a mixture of Danish sort of historical art. You get a fantastic collection of Impressionist art and realist art. So they don't just do Impressionist, they go from the French realist as well. Corot, you know, Courbet, Delacroix, Ang. They have all these artists in the collection as well. And then they basically, then they have a contemporary space where they would invite artists like Telar, you know, contemporary artists to come and sort of respond to the space and put on exhibitions. So it's a great combination of, you know, history and contemporary art, which I think museums should be. I think that's a really nice way of doing things. They also have sculptures in the parkland, so they very much invest in the here and now. It's not just a museum locked in one part of time.
Yeah, although with the Ordrupgaard, what I found also so interesting, and you lead off with that in the film, is the furniture
yes.
and etc. And how carefully that was crafted and selected and so on.
Oh yes, they were very much, and they were very that the Hansens were supporters of Danish craftsmanship, of basically getting the best architects or the best designers to come and design their furniture. They could afford it. And, you know, they were also very interested in their relationship with the house and the garden, you know, that you always had a view out to the garden, or you had passageways out to the garden. So they were very much about flowers and nature and bringing nature into the house. So you get a sense of that through the photography, I hope. You get that little journey of that relationship between furniture, paintings, house. It was a private collection, essentially, that now has become a public collection, but it actually lived in a house, basically, and an annex of exhibition spaces. But it's an interesting story because Hansen, when there was a bank collapse in the 1920s, he wanted to sell his whole collection to the state for a cut down price. He was basically offering them an opportunity to create this great collection so it would get him out of debt. And they said no. And he got a bit peeved by that. So he decided to sell half of it on the market so he could clear his debts. And as soon as he'd sold that, he started collecting again. But he always wanted his collection to be open to the public. And once he'd finished his collection, he started to open it. One day a week, he opened his house to the public to come and see his collection, which I thought was quite nice. He was into education and people understanding art. And then they actually had a son, which he doesn't feature in the film at all. They had a son called Newt, who eventually, the whole legacy was going to be left to him, but he died before Henny died. And so Henny was left with the collection, and she decided then that really what she wants to do is to honor Wilhelm's wishes and just leave it to the state. The house, the paintings, everything was left. And it's basically like a time machine. It's been left exactly the way they had left it.
What an interesting story. And yeah, I had no idea about that issue.
Yeah, so
yeah.
I realized there's one little element that had been just slightly left out of the story, but I mean, there's so many parts, and in an 80 to 90 minute film, it's sometimes difficult to know what sort of stories to tell. But
Sure. Obviously, always decisions have to be made. I understand that perfectly. Yeah. So the Danish Collector is, I know, releasing in Australia on the 2nd of December, which is great. And it gives people an opportunity, A, to be back in cinemas, which is fantastic, and B, to see the film in the cinema. So, which is where I would
urge people to go and see it in the cinema. Let's get back into the cinema. Let's get that big screen experience back. More for that.
Yes. And can you tell us about some of the possible films coming up? Because you're quite prolific, you and Phil, in terms of producing these films. They're great.
Yes, well, I think the current season that you will have in Australia has Frida Kahlo, which was very much affected by, made by a great filmmaker, Ali Ray. And her film was actually interrupted very much by COVID, the release of it. So they've decided to give it a proper release, and it's a great film. It's all, she travels to Mexico and to the Blue House. And it's a great insight into Frida Kahlo.
Yes, I've seen it. It's great. Yep.
Yes, it's a brilliant film. And then for Easter, I think there's Easter in Art, which is one of Phil's films. And then I'm currently working on the finishing touch, I'm just really putting together the edit really at the moment for Camille Pissarro, the father of Impressionism, which I've literally just come back from filming at his studio in his house and things like that still exists in the north of France. And I'm really excited about it. Great story. He wrote lots and lots of letters to his son, Lucien. So that's coming out in, I think, next year for you guys. And also there's the Art of Canaletto and the Art of Venice, that's happening with you. But also, like I said, we're working on America Sat film. We're looking at Edward Hopper. There's various things that other things we keep plowing on, even though it's been quite difficult during COVID and obviously financially challenging with cinemas. But we've been trying to find other outlets, online stuff and things like that. But we keep surviving.
Yes, and we should mention that Seventh Art Productions, you've got a website where you can see additional scenes or other bits and pieces for each of the films too.
And also you can download the past catalogue, so you can see the other films that we've been making. So they are all available to stream online. And yes, we do try to make a lot of behind the scenes production shots, and you get little interviews with, you know, what the process and how we go about it. You know, we're in quite a privileged position a lot of the time because we're alone in these gallery spaces filming them, and it is quite amazing. It is. I do pinch myself sometimes when I think of the, you know, being alone with some great art in the world. It is a brilliant experience.
It is. If you can't get to an art gallery, the next best thing is seeing the film.
Exactly, that's what I would say. Thank you,
David, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We've been speaking to David Bickerstaff, the director of the Danish Collector Delacroix to Gaugain, which is the latest exhibition on screen film released in Australian cinemas from December 2nd. David, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Brilliant.